Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of the POK Podcast. My name is Jordan, and this is my partner, Dylan. For this first episode, we are going to tell you guys a little bit about us, the story behind what led to us wanting to make a podcast, and overall, kind of what we hope to achieve with this podcast. We want to let you guys know that, full disclosure, we both have a script in front of us. This is not to script what we say, but to just kind of make sure we cover all the points that we wanted to cover, keep us on track, and help us establish a flow for, our podcast.
Yeah, so what is this podcast all about? And in short, we want to more or less have a conversationalist-like podcast discussing controversial issues. One of the reasons for this, and probably one of the biggest ones, is that these types of conversations typically become polarized very quickly and end up turning into political debates versus conversations that should and rather be informative. Mm-hmm. And we want to try and correct ship on that. And so, for example, some of the topics that we might cover is healthcare policy, gun violence. In the case of today's show, we want to talk a little bit about media bias, since that's the source of most of our information. Mm-hmm. And so just to give a little insight as to how we'll be going about this, each week, ideally, we'll be discussing a specific topic. And around that topic, we're going to collect articles, relevant articles, and news stories that have happened recently to be kind of the pivot points for our conversation. Right. And what's most important about that is we want to have a conversation about what do we actually need to know in order to have an informed discussion about the topics that we often end up bringing up when it comes time to vote. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, just to kind of give our own take, or rather a big picture conversation about what that all means.
Right. And so what we hope to do with this podcast is to deconstruct some of these complex topics to achieve a fuller understanding of all of the contributing factors. So what all goes into this, big polarizing political or social or economical issue. To do this, we need to make a conscious effort to remove personal bias, which is not always easy to do, but to remove personal bias in addition to the political bias that a lot of these reported news stories kind of have attached onto them. And it's important to point out, I think, that everyone has bias on just about every issue, and that's okay. That's just part of what makes us human. But when we're discussing these big kind of impactful and polarizing ideas, we have to leave our biases at the door.
Yeah, and this is something that Jordan and I actually kind of already do, and what we really want to try and, just to reiterate, is initiate a conversation rather than a debate. But what we've kind of noticed is that when we look at news headlines and we look at social media, we notice there's a lot of different brands of bias, and oftentimes that ends up leading to misinformation or misleading information that people end up deriving their own belief system around, and that can create some problems.
Yeah, and so I think starting off, we should say, for example, politics was something I was never much interested in. I grew up in the rural South, and talking about politics and talking about these big polarizing issues always led to an argument, and who could yell louder, and who was the bigger, angrier beast. That's what kind of won that debate. So it was just never for me. But after the presidential election of Donald Trump, I kind of had this moment of, all right, what the hell is actually going on? Like, this doesn't seem good. And
it's a fair question.
I don't know what's going on. So that really led me to deep dive into understanding a lot of these issues and what goes into them, what can be done about them, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it feels like with a lot of these topics that we hope to talk about, the conversations around them are kind of long overdue. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we preach all the time that, yeah, we need to have a conversation about it, not a debate about it. Yet that's all we seem to do
Have the debate.
is debate about it. And a big part of that comes from the bias of our media. And, we see this in our friends and family. And when we try and have conversations about these particular conversation or rather controversial topics, it ends up seeming like whoever you're talking with, we both live in two completely different worlds.
Right.
And that's just not the reality. But that's what it ends up seeming like.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I experience bias in the news all the time, literally every single morning when I bring Jordan her coffee. I will read up on a dozen or so articles, it seems like, just to get one news story, like one complete picture of what actually happened in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And from my experience, it seems like most news outlets, to some degree, have a political bias or a political agenda attached to them. And they end up reporting on stories that support that agenda. And then on top of that, a lot of these articles are written with loaded rhetoric, or they have real kind of clickbaity headlines tagged to them.
And it is everywhere.
Yeah, and it's not founded in factual evidence. It's for a persuasive purpose.
To incite a response.
Yeah, and to get you to read more into whatever it is they want to say versus what actually happens sometimes. Now, that's not always the case, but that's the way it can come off. And we're getting into this point now where I feel like our conversations about politics are becoming so polarized that most of us feel like we just can't have them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the questions that this brings up is, how in the world do you stay informed when all of this bias in the media is occurring, and that no matter what information you're getting, it seems to be filtered through some sort of political lens.
Mm-hmm.
First, just kind of reiterate, to stay informed on any one topic, you have to read multiple articles from multiple different outlets just to get the complete picture.
Right.
And most people don't have the time to do that. And
it's insanely time consuming.
Yeah, and then if you're on social media, that problem is exaggerated tenfold.
Yeah. So again, full disclosure, my big girl job is working in social media, and social media has a lot of wonderful benefits, but one of the downsides is that it is this open platform. It is kind of open content, and that allows for a lot of content that is misinformed or extremist, or skewing information, and even photoshops, and it's all for a very specific political agenda or to elicit emotional response. There's always,
or just to be a troll,
right? That happens too. There's plenty of internet trolls, but it all has a purpose. And so for people that are aware of how social media works in this regard, it's pretty easy to be like, all right, whatever. You can just kind of look at it and be like, I think that's maybe not super true. And then you Google it if you want to check it. But there are plenty of other people who maybe aren't quite as aware of how social content works. And for a lot of these people, it could start off as, them having a Facebook page and seeing something that was a little bit leftist or a little bit rightist, and being like, oh yeah, I think that's great. And then there's no follow through. And so this is something I experience in my job a lot. I work for a dog toy company that is specifically geared to large breeds or dogs that have a hard time not chewing up their toys. And so it's a lot of our advertisements feature pit bulls and Rottweilers and Dobermans and that kind of thing. And we are constantly having to weed out comments about, pit bulls are dangerous. They'll turn on you. They have a chemical imbalance in their brain. They'll attack your children. Just on and on and on. And most of the time there is no factual basis for anything these people are saying. However,
and just to add to this, just to kind of also full disclosure about our bias in that particular
so we do own a pit bull. He's a pit bull mastiff mix, and a lot of our friends and family members also own pit bull type dogs. So we do have a bias towards that kind of animal.
Yeah, and we were just talking about this earlier. One of the often sometimes hilarious phenomenon that you see on social media around particularly pit bulls is when people start dropping statistics about them and then make a generalization about how they're like the most lethal dog breed and how they're just killers and whatnot. And if you do the math and you read up on the cases, and what it turns out is you are about as likely to be struck by lightning twice and killed by that as you are to be killed by a pit bull.
And there's a lot of factors that we will do an episode on pit bulls at some point.
We have some opinions.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into that particular topic, but there are plenty of people that have seen stories on the news or read articles where some sort of incident occurred, and the reporting on it was very clear in their agenda to demonize pit bulls. And there are plenty of sites online. Dylan was talking about.
Yeah, I think it's, I might be wrong with the web address, but something like dogbites.org. It's like one of the first things that pops up when you do a Google search on dog bites and deaths by dog bites. And it's this website. We'll jump off this topic here in a minute and continue on. Obviously, this is important to us. But
right.
But yeah, it was created and funded by this woman who was attacked by a pit bull, and so the whole website is quite literally dedicated towards
demonizing pit bulls. That's the goal of this website, and it's ranked really high. And so, again, it's a very clear example of the wildfire spread of misinformation. And so, bringing it back around, as important as social media is for a lot of issues, it's also very easy to spread false rhetoric and to share things without any kind of factual or informational basis and have people buy into those things that are being shared.
Yeah, and so kind of the result of that is that you have this good chunk of people that, in addition to just not having the time to stay informed, the information that they are getting is inherently misleading, especially if you get it from social media. And so kind of what I see is like three different categories of people, right? So you have the uninformed or unintentionally misinformed group that just doesn't have the time to stay informed or chooses not to. And then you have the uninterested group, which I think is probably a much larger chunk of people, where it's hard to even, where do you even go to get reliable information?
Right, because the reality is that most people are concerned about their jobs and their spouses and their children and their home, and on and on and on and on and on. To be concerned about big policies, it's way too much work.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to the third and the unicorn of the bunch. Which is the informed individual, which, to be fair here, not to say that there aren't experts on plenty of these topics, but kind of what we end up getting is that because information is so biased now, and the outlets for which we get our information is so biased, and often has a persuasive element to it, it's so difficult to get a complete picture of all the facts surrounding a particular topic of interest.
Right.
See that with gun violence. You see that with healthcare. You see that with the criminalization of marijuana. It really just kind of depends on where you fall on the political spectrum as to whether or not you, or what selection of facts that you have, and where you get your information from.
Right, and to kind of piggyback off that. Technology makes it even more difficult to stay informed because of the way algorithms work in regards to Facebook and Google and other search engines, because they are designed to show you content that agrees with you, right? So the more data you put into these sites like Google and sites like Facebook, the more they learn about what you like and what you don't like, what you agree with, what you don't agree with. So if you're someone who, let's say, is always looking at dog videos, then they're going to start showing you more dog videos and recommending ads for dog products and that kind of thing. So it's constantly trying to confirm whatever beliefs you already have, and then ultimately sell you something based on that belief. That's kind of the goal of a lot of this information collecting. And so that can be problematic when you're trying to collect information. There's actually a really awesome TED Talk on this particular topic, as far as algorithms go and being given content that agrees with you. This African-American guy had gone out with the intent to basically screw with the algorithm of Facebook. I believe it was Facebook. We'll link this down below so you guys can check it out if you're interested. But his goal was to kind of see what other parts of the internet were like, not just what he had seen from what had been recommended to him. And eventually he ends up being in conversations with these white supremacists and kind of learning their perspective. And he's kind of like fake being one of them via the internet. And it's really fascinating. And it kind of shines a light on the idea that we are all just trying to live our lives and do our jobs and take care of our, our own.
We're definitely more similar than we are different.
Right. So it's a really fascinating video, and he does a really good job explaining the idea of algorithms, if you guys want to check that out.
Yeah, so this just kind of highlights in many ways how technology is kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to the spread of information. So on one hand, right, it makes getting information or the access to information really easily accessible.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this extra obstacle you have to overcome where you can't be sure all the time that from a news outlet in particular, and also social media, that information is wholly accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And then to that point, on Facebook, you have, and also on Twitter,
mm-hmm.
I think this is actually where this example came from, about photos being doctored.
Mm.
The Emma Gonzalez photo, I'm sure many of you have probably heard about this, or this photo of Emma Gonzalez on Twitter went viral, where she was holding up I think it was like a target.
Yeah, it's like a shooting practice target, the original
photo that she was tearing up,
mm-hmm.
and someone doctored the picture to make it look like she was tearing up the Constitution.
It wasn't even good Photoshop either.
Yeah, but if you don't think twice about it, it looks real enough.
Well, people went crazy over that photo in regards to her and what the implications of that were, and it was just a doctored photo. It was a poorly doctored photo, but it went absolutely viral.
Yeah, and you saw people making these really harsh generalizations about her character and how she's trying to ruin America and tear up the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. And none of it found in factual evidence. It was entirely fabricated. But people, bid on it and ran with it.
Mm-hmm.
And in a much more scary case, in my opinion, if you guys haven't heard about this, I definitely recommend checking it out because it is cool and also
terrifying.
BuzzFeed did this post or article with Jordan Peele. They collaborated, and they were using this app. I believe it's called Fake App. I'll double check on that, but we'll post a link in the comment section. But generally, what they ended up doing is they took this app, Fake App, and it uses AI technology to do
face mapping
to do a voiceover in real time of really anybody.
Right.
And so you can create a whole fabricated video that makes it look like someone is saying something that they would never actually say. And they do an example of this with Barack Obama. If you know anything about Jordan Peele, you can just take a wild guess at what he made Obama say that was ridiculous.
Yeah.
But check the video out yourself. but it's really scary because it's photorealistic. It looks like Obama, and Jordan Peele is real good at doing the Obama accent,
Yeah.
and so it sounds just like Obama saying something that he would never say.
Side note: if you guys have never checked out the Key and Peele Obama anger translation videos, you definitely should because they're hilarious.
Just bouncing off that even further is to go back to these algorithms, right? Is that our own biases, even our implicit ones, the ones that we aren't always aware of. Google picks up on that. The algorithms pick up on that. The content that we see or that we actively seek out is what's going to end up being put in front of us. And that's really dangerous. And so,
because you're creating a bubble for yourself, that this is the way the world exists, and you're not being exposed to any other, opposing views. That's dangerous.
Yeah. And then you get, with certain outlets and, depending on where their political bias leans, if a story comes out and your algorithm or the algorithm is telling, Google Newsstand or wherever you get your news, oh, this person likes to hear stories that have this particular bias attached to them or from these particular outlets. And so it's going to fill up your news feed with articles solely from those outlets. And you're only going to get the perspective of those outlets. And a great example of this is when in recent news, right, when it came out that Sean Hannity, I think, was a client of Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer.
There was an implication that Sean Hannity was also a client of Michael Cohen.
Yeah, and if you had any kind of anti-Trump bias, if you look at CNN at all, this your whole newsfeed was blown up with this. I remember the day this came out because I look at so many different articles. Google Newsstand has no idea what to do with me. So it really just depends on the day and which news I'm getting.
Well, what the news is, what happened.
Yeah, but depending on where you look, the story of what happened was two different stories. And the facts that you were presented with were not always consistent, right? So you had like one outlet that was talking about, it was reported that Sean Hannity was Michael Cohen's lawyer, that Michael Cohen was Sean Hannity's lawyer, and then went immediately into speculation and trying to attack the credibility of the network that he was a part of. And on the other side of that spectrum, right, you had people that were like, well, how is this relevant at all? Where is the relevance here? And also that Sean Hannity is not doesn't consider himself a journalist and has gone on air saying this a couple of times. And so understanding and recognizing the whole picture is really important. And what you ended up seeing is that even today, I'm still getting news articles on my feed about what's happening with Sean Hannity. And I don't really care that much about Sean Hannity.
Right. And I think that brings up the whole issue of what counts as news. And is this news or is this a distraction? Is it going back to the idea of like, this is more fodder for attacking each other, the news networks, than it is actual news. And so that it's just a distraction from what's actually going on in the world.
Yeah, and I have a real problem with this too, right? And I've heard from family and friends all the time about what news outlets they prefer, because I'm always kind of curious about where people get their information from, especially if I'm going to try and have an informed discussion with them. But what ends up happening is a lot of the responses I get is, oh, I go to this news outlet because they're the only outlet that represents my beliefs. And in the back of my head, I'm like, that's not the right way to go about that.
No.
If you're only seeking out information that agrees with the stuff that you already believe, you're not getting anything new. And what we know about the world and in politics and, the social sciences, et cetera, business, technology, all of that changes on a daily basis. And so allowing your beliefs to be tangible with what new information comes out seems like it would be the ideal. But that just doesn't seem to be like what people often end up doing or prefer, because I feel like it's a defensive reaction,
right?
Where at least now in the media, there's a high prevalence of anti-Republican media, if you want to call it that. We'll call it that.
We'll call it that.
right? And a lot of people, I feel like, have gone to Fox News or started to view Fox News as a way, as almost like a rebellious kind of
Right.
response to it, and vice versa, of course, with anti-democratic or anti-liberal news, whatever that even means these days. Just because even those terms, even those political terms, have been so grossly mischaracterized that people feel like they have a absolute like duty to defend their political beliefs.
Well, and so for those of you that aren't familiar, this idea of only hearing things that you agree with falls into the definition of confirmation bias. And so if you're not familiar with confirmation bias, here's how it works. You have an idea or a preconceived notion that you've gathered from, it could be television, it could be talking with your peers, it could be some other form of information input, right? And then when you read a news article or you see a news story that agrees with that preconceived notion, there's this moment of like, aha, I knew it. I knew I was right. The news just said it, so I knew I was right. And there's a really great analogy that John Oliver does on his show Last Week Tonight, where he basically says, what's the first thing you think about when you hear the name Richard Gere? Obviously, the audience laughs, and then he follows that up by saying, there's no factual evidence to support that ever happened. And if you're familiar with those animals, that would be a very difficult thing to accomplish. But if the president were to get on stage tomorrow and say that it happened, there would be plenty of people that would go, I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it.
And they wouldn't think twice about it.
And they wouldn't think twice about it. So same thing goes for news media and people of power when they say things that confirm what you already believe. There is this sensation of like, I knew I was right. And that kind of perpetuates this cycle of, this bubble of what you agree with. And unfortunately, as we have learned, news media does not always mean accurate news.
That's I think that's an accurate statement. Another form of bias worth mentioning, and just to kind of compound on to these implicit biases of confirmation bias and language bias, is racial bias, racial and gender bias, and specifically on the racial bias bit. And this is relevant to today's coverage of media or media coverage. I'm thinking about the Texas bombings that happened recently. And there was a fairly obvious racial bias in the way it was reported. Joe and I were just talking about how, when the news first came out about it.
It took forever.
Yeah, it took forever for mainstream media to get a hold of it.
I didn't even know that it was happening until Dylan found an article that was mentioning it. And it had been happening for several weeks at that point. And it was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, it was happening on a weekly basis. And it's kind of hard to deny that there was a racial bias in there.
Right.
Not to say that it might have been an intentional bias, but it absolutely was the reality of what happened.
Right.
Is that the mainstream media in particular, was hesitant to report on it because a white male was
bombing minorities
and sending packages to their homes. You could make the excuse that they didn't want to cause a public commotion, or they didn't want to incite chaos, whatever it may be. But there was a very clear racial bias in the way they reported on it, and even further on how they reported on the bomber himself, who was a white male. And under any other definition, he was, or rather, any other perspective, he was a terrorist.
He was a domestic terrorist.
However you want to look at it, no matter how you interpret what happened, he was a terrorist by definition. And there was a severe lack of consistency in the reporting until much later, when they finally labeled him a domestic terrorist. But something interesting that I found out, and I think it was NPR that reported on this. If I find it, I'll put the link into the description.
We're going to have all the links in the description.
All the links, all the resources. But they were talking about language bias as it relates to reporting on racial issues,
Right.
and prejudice. And one of the things that they found out is, and I think, and I'll correct myself in the comments if I need to with this one, but I believe they found out that it was a white person would have to kill 7 more people than someone who was non-white in order to gain the same amount of media coverage in regards to terrorism. And that's shocking. Like, we all kind of knew that was the reality, I feel like, that there wasn't like an implicit racial bias in the media. Well, but that kind of like highlighted just how drastic that is.
I also wonder I just think it's interesting, this idea, this reservation to call him a domestic terrorist. Like, I would be interested to get to the root of why that happens and why it took so long for them to call him a domestic terrorist.
Well, it's a fear thing, right? At least that's the way it came off to me is, and I might be completely off base with this one, but if you report on it and there's repercussions for it, right? Or rather, there is, if you could get called out for being racist or saying something that's could be interpreted as racist. We see this all the time in discussions about racism.
Right.
That no one wants to talk about it because they don't want to seem like the bad guy.
No one wants it. Yeah, we've talked about this before, this fear of being labeled racist.
Well, if you admit it's happening, it makes it real.
That's true, too.
If you admit that there's some white dude going around blowing up black people because he thinks black people are inferior, that is racist and terrorism. And to call it those things makes it the reality.
Yeah, so I almost wonder if people, like, they don't want to accept that kind of thing exists, that racism exists, that this is a problem. So if they just don't report on it, then they don't have to accept that reality.
Yeah, that's totally what it is.
Well, and even beyond racial bias, I think there's significant evidence to suggest that there's lots of gender bias in the media. And it takes form in a lot of different ways, but we looked up the statistic on the ratio of male to female, and whether it is reporters or stories or what have you, it is almost always a 3-to-1 ratio of men to women. And so even beyond that, there is a very clear preference for young, beautiful women reporters in the media. And there's fewer. I like adjectives, adverbs. Whatever those were.
We graduated college, we promise.
I have a degree, I promise. So
don't you have a master's in literature?
I do. I have a master's in literature, and sometimes I get words wrong. That's okay. But for example, there are very few older females that are on television for news reporting, and I think it's definitely because we still see women as, specifically older women, we still see them as weaker and feeble and fragile, and maybe their brain isn't quite there anymore. But meanwhile, we see older gentlemen as distinguished and worldly and knowledgeable and trustworthy. And that it's upsetting to me. I definitely think that we're slowly changing that.
And we also see that, just to add to that, is we see that in articles all the time, or at least I do.
Right.
Where you can pretty easily tell if you read closely whether or not, or this is for any article, what the intended audience is. Mm-hmm. But there are some very clear articles that are geared towards women, particularly around beauty standards.
Yes.
Still, and even the language that's used, and this applies to both racial bias and a gender bias, is the rhetoric that's used is specifically designed to elicit a certain kind of response or to attract a certain kind of audience.
Right.
And so particularly when marketing products to women or marketing stories to women, that's very apparent.
Right. Well, and what I had we talked about this earlier. You even see things like there will be news stories where they will include information to elicit an emotional response that otherwise didn't really have any relevance on the story. So,
Do you notice that happens a lot? I feel like with severe tragedies,
including like tertiary information.
Well, and I feel like I'm gonna sound bad for saying this, but that's okay. That's part of the process.
We can sound bad.
I feel like whenever a tragedy hits the news, one of the first things that we hear about is what the victims are going through.
Right.
Right, as opposed to the causality of the event or the facts surrounding the circumstances. I guess I'm thinking even with there was a recent event where a Southwest airline, a plane had one of the engines blew up in flight. They were like going from, I think it was New York to Texas, and like when they're like in flight for like 30 minutes or something, reached like 30,000 feet.
Right.
And the engine blew out. And you know, they had, I think there was one person that died from shrapnel damage because she was getting pulled out the window.
Right.
But when they were reporting on the story, and this might be my own personal bias as well, is I noticed a lot of what they were saying were just eyewitness accounts of what happened.
Right.
Versus technicians. Fun fact, the pilot of that airplane who managed the heroic landing, she was a woman. Fun fact. And to that point, actually, there was a article that came out about her. I think it was I don't remember which news outlet it was, but it said we shouldn't be surprised the pilot was a woman.
When in reality, we shouldn't give a teetotal hug what gender the pilot was. The pilot did an amazing job and should be applauded for their amazing job, regardless of what gender they identify with. It's such a... Yes, it's great. Girl power. Woohoo. It was a woman that landed the plane. But also, it was just an awesome pilot. Who cares what her gender was?
Yeah, sometimes I think we attach the tag of gender as a way of maybe dealing with the guilt of making that mistake in the first place.
It's almost like they're trying to like, oh, she's especially good because she's a lady and she did it. And it's like, no, she's a pilot and she did her job and she did her job very well. Like, it doesn't make it more impressive that she was a lady, just like it would make it less impressive if it was a man.
Exactly.
So to bring that back around, even though we're seeing a cultural change in regards to women and the Me Too movement and kind of coming forward and expressing themselves and establishing themselves in different ways, there's still a very clear gender bias in a lot of the things that we see in the media specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of close this up. So given that there's all this bias going on, and excuse me, in some cases this bias and actually in a lot of cases this bias will lead to misleading information. How do we stay informed? Well, as with any problem, you have to admit there is one to actually come to a solution, right?
Right.
And so being aware of all these different kinds of biases and how they present themselves in the media is really important, so you can have an eye out for it. So when you're reading an article or you're listening to a news reporting, right, you can kind of filter out some of that stuff. But also you kind of have to have the facts straight, right? And how do you get those when you have to, when most people can't or don't have the time to look at 5 or 6 different news outlets for the same story just to get all the facts?
Well, I think that, I mean, the kind of the outline of this podcast is, hey, it's really hard to get all the information, but also if you want to be informed, it's worth it. Or you could just listen to this podcast and we'll help you with some of these topics, hopefully.
Yeah, and to that point, if I feel like a lot of these topics are going to be somewhat uncomfortable to talk about,
right?
Or they're going to be topics that some members of our audience might think that they don't know enough to be a part of that conversation. And we absolutely want those people to be a part of this conversation, because uh, what we hope to do is try and establish what do you actually need to know,
Right.
To at least formulate an opinion on these topics. And that's kind of going to be our end of it, right?
Right.
And so on the audience's end, right, it's what else can we add to this conversation?
Right.
The goal is to keep this conversation going,
right,
so that we can get more information. Treat this as an exchange of information versus us just talking at you.
Well, and to add to your point about being uncomfortable, I think it's important to feel uncomfortable, right?
Oh yeah.
So there's a lot of these topics that make people a little squeamish, and I think that leads to them avoiding topics, avoiding conversations about certain topics, and just kind of being like,
or they just don't want to sound stupid,
right? Or they don't want to sound stupid. But specifically in regards to uncomfortable, feeling uncomfortable is important in the sense that I think if you're being mindful and being reflective and trying to expand your mind, and something makes you uncomfortable, it's important to kind of look in yourself and be like, all right, this thing makes me uncomfortable. Why do I feel that way? What preconceived notion, what idea, what about this is making me feel discomfort? And how can
and what does that say about some of your own personal biases? And
Right.
being aware of your own biases is really important. We're not always aware of them, especially our implicit biases, and the associations that we make when we're not even aware that we're making them.
Right.
And that's something to look at as from looking to insight as to why we are feeling the way we are about these topics.
Well, maybe part of this is like a mindfulness exercise, and understanding different things from different perspectives, and also being mindful of how you feel about them, how you're reacting, and why you feel that way.
Yeah, and so to kind of close out this section, we're going to want to try and give you guys some resources to help you guys out, so you can do some fact checking. And we really encourage you to do this. That you can't just get news from one outlet and expect it to give you the whole picture.
Right.
Especially when you're talking about these big, complex beasts, especially like healthcare, education. There's so many moving pieces in these stories and in these conversations that you can't just get a sliver or a slice of that pie and expect to know.
One article is not going to give you all the information that you need to know. So the first resource we want to encourage you guys to check out is MediaBiasFactCheck.com. We will link that down below. So this site is really awesome. It is a collective database of news outlets, and its primary function is to rank the bias of factual reporting of different news outlets, as well as give you, there's like a sliding scale. And so it lets you know, okay, how factual and how frequently.
Yeah. So maybe I visit this site a little bit more frequently, so maybe I can give a little bit better description here. So it operates on two different scales. So one is like this slider scale from leftist bias to far right bias to somewhere to least bias in the middle. And it is a bit of a simplification of bias in that regard, or just on a political spectrum. But it's really useful for just kind of getting a quick glance at where your media source falls on that spectrum. And they're very transparent about their methodology on that. And then the other bit that that Jordan was referring to is their factual reporting.
Right.
And that's more of just a quick rating from like high to low.
Right. Well, and also, is it that site? Oh, no, this site is the one that's transparent. So this site is also very transparent about where their money comes from. And all the profit they make is made solely through Google AdSense. So that means that the only income that they are getting from providing this information is ads that are running in their sidebars and their headers and their footers that are posted there by Google. And so this is another really important thing of knowing where an organization is getting its money from. This is very crucial in understanding what the agenda of a news outlet or a politician or, what have you. If their money is coming from a specific source, that specific source is going to have pull and influence on what and how that person talks about certain topics.
just to kind of follow that up, right, is transparency about where a resource gets its money from is probably one of the biggest tells as to whether or not it's reliable. And so keeping that in mind, reliable news sources or reliable fact bank kind of news outlets or resource outlets, they're usually very transparent about this. And you can just go right to their About Me page and see where their funding comes from, and see if it's from something that has a biased agenda or if it's a charitable cause or wherever it's coming from. That'll give you some insight as to where they are leaning as far as the information that they're providing.
Right.
And that kind of brings us to another source, which is pewresearch.com. I really like this. .org, pewresearch.org.
We'll link it down below, don't worry.
Yeah, so this website is a nonpartisan fact tank. It's centered in D.C. They are very transparent about their funding, release their tax forms, things like that. And what I think this site is particularly useful for is if you want to get kind of the stats about a particular issue that you're interested in,
right?
Or just a social trend,
right?
They cover a huge range of topics. They've been around for decades, often cited by news outlets themselves,
right?
So it is a fairly reliable source. And just to kind of close that up, for these resources that we're giving you guys, it's mostly we're really suggesting that you guys do is that, because obviously you don't have the time, or most people don't have the time to just for every single thing they hear to fact check it, but for like the things you read on social media, maybe this is a good resource for you, right? So if you read something on social media or you see a meme that's posting something that sounds outrageous or doesn't sound like it's true, but you're not sure, this is a good way to check.
Right, or even if something comes up, we all have Google on our phones, and Google always recommends articles based on what you're interested in. So if there's a Google recommended article and you read it and you're like, that sounds odd, these are resources that you can use to quickly check, the legitimacy of this story, the legitimacy of the people publishing it, and kind of get a clear idea of whether this is a trustworthy story to be listening to, And finally, we want to extend the conversation to you guys. That's a big part of what we're trying to do here, is that this is a conversation. We want to be able to, obviously we're talking to each other, but we want to be able to talk to you too. We want you guys to let us know, what do you think about bias in the media? Do you think that there's things that we missed? Is there things that we could have been more clear about? Is there a topic that you want us to cover that you think needs a nice deep dive on all of the elements that go into it? We're here, and we'll try our best to reply to the comments and have this conversation with you. And also, if you liked the first edition of the POK podcast, be sure to like and subscribe so you can stay up to date on all the things that we're doing. Like Dylan said, we're going to try and do a video every week, and we'll have seasons, and we'll constantly, hopefully, be pulling from headlines and then kind of looking at the bigger picture of what those news stories are.
And also, just to add to that as well, is if you want to catch up or see the resources that we post in our videos, that's also going to be posted on our website.
Yep.
POKpodcast.com.
We'll link.
So we have like a resources page that includes the resources that we mentioned in this podcast, but we'll also include links to our videos as well, and bios about us if you're curious a little bit more about our backgrounds.
Right. And if you guys, maybe share this with someone that you want to have a conversation with, but, don't know where to start. We are here to promote educated conversations, educated discussions, and, working towards a fuller understanding of, what a lot of these huge topics mean. We hope you have a wonderful day. And remember, the more you know, the more you can contribute.
See you next time.
Bye.